There are places where war ends, but the horror never leaves. Places where every step may conceal a bomb forgotten for more than a century, where entire forests vanished, cities ceased to exist, and thousands of bodies remain buried beneath the earth. That place exists. Its name is Verdun, and what happened there was so devastating that it turned a piece of France into an open wound that remains to this day. For 10 months, men were sent to die knowing they would hardly return, not to conquer vast territories, but to feed a machine of destruction planned down to the smallest detail. This was not just a battle, it was an experiment in industrial-scale extermination. Welcome to the Hell of Verdun. To understand why Verdun became one of the darkest chapters in human history, we need to go back to the moment when the First World War seemed completely deadlocked. At the beginning of 1916, millions of soldiers remained motionless in miles of trenches stretching across Europe from end to end. The armies dug deeper and deeper. The weapons became increasingly deadly, yet neither alliance could achieve a decisive victory. That was when a single man envisioned a plan capable of completely changing the course of the war, not by conquering territory, but by destroying an entire country's ability to keep fighting. And that was exactly what turned Verdun into the greatest meat grinder in modern history. But there is one disturbing detail. The true objective of that offensive was never to capture Verdun. It was something far crueler. By 1915, the so-called Great War had reached a stalemate. From northern France to the Swiss border, thousands of miles of trenches divided the German and French armies. For months, attacks were launched almost daily. The result was always the same: hundreds, sometimes thousands dead. To capture just a few yards of mud, every advance came at an absurd cost. Every counterattack erased the previous effort. It was a war without movement, without progress, without hope. Meanwhile, the numbers kept rising at an alarming rate. Military cemeteries expanded faster than any gains on the battlefield. It was in this scenario that a completely different strategy emerged, a strategy that did not seek a quick victory. It intended to win through attrition. At the head of the German General Staff was General Erich von Falkenhayn, cold calculating, and convinced that there was only one way to defeat France. According to his analysis, the country had limited human reserves. If it were forced to defend a place considered sacred to its national pride, it would continue sending soldiers indefinitely, and sooner or later, it would run out of men to fight. The idea was simple, but terrifyingly effective. Instead of attacking the entire front line, the Germans would concentrate enormous firepower in a single sector. They would create a massive funnel of death. Whenever a French division was destroyed, another would be sent, then another, and another. Until the entire army was exhausted, it would not be a battle for territory. It would be a battle of statistics. Human life would become nothing more than a number. Later, Falkenhayn would summarize this strategy in a phrase that would go down in history. France had to be bled white. But one decision still remained. Where would this trap be set? The answer was Verdun. And there was a deeply symbolic reason for it. At first glance, Verdun seemed like just another fortified town, but its importance went far beyond its military value. It represented centuries of French resistance. It was a national symbol, a place no government would accept abandoning. Falkenhayn fully understood the enemy's psychology. He believed that faced with the threat of losing Verdun, Paris would keep sending reinforcements without end. And that was exactly what he wanted. Every train loaded with French soldiers meant more men voluntarily entering the largest killing ground ever planned up to that point. But no one imagined the scale of the storm that was about to begin. On the morning of February 21st, 1916, shortly after 7 o'clock, the silence of winter was shattered with brutal force. The sky darkened, the ground began to tremble, and within seconds, the entire horizon was engulfed in flashes. It was not merely a bombardment. It was something the world had never witnessed before. More than 1,200 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously across a front only 12 kilometers wide. The impact was so intense that many soldiers believed the earth itself was splitting apart. The Germans called this technique Trommelfeuer, drum fire. The name was fitting. The explosions came so rapidly that they no longer sounded like individual shots. They merged into a single continuous roar, an unending sound, heavy, hypnotic, capable of driving anyone insane. The shockwaves tore through trenches, crushed lungs, and made the ground shake without pause in just 10 hours. Roughly 1 million shells struck the French positions. It was as if the entire sky were collapsing. Below, hidden in underground shelters, thousands of soldiers remained motionless. The earth shook like a ship caught in a colossal storm. Each explosion seemed closer than the last. Some prayed, others screamed. Many simply lost their sanity. Some went mad before even seeing a single enemy. When the bombardment finally eased, the worst was yet to come. The German infantry began its advance, but what they found was not exactly a battlefield. It was a landscape that seemed to belong to another planet. The villages had vanished. The roads no longer existed. The trees had been reduced to charred trunks rising like skeletal hands pointing toward the sky. Everything had been transformed into craters, and that devastation was only the beginning, because the Germans carried with them a weapon that would take terror to an entirely different level. While Douaumont symbolized a strategic failure, another name was beginning to enter history: Fort Vaux. There, the French decided to resist to the very limits of human endurance. The commander responsible for its defense was Major Sylvain Eugène Raynal. He knew reinforcements would almost certainly never arrive. He also knew that abandoning that position would open the way for the German advance. His decision was simple: stay, no matter the cost. What happened over the following days surpassed everything war books had recorded up to that point. As the attacks intensified, the surface became impossible to occupy. The battle moved inside the fortress. Narrow corridors, underground galleries, completely dark rooms. That was where hundreds of men struggled to survive. Soon, the water reservoirs were destroyed by the bombardment. Every drop became precious. The soldiers spent entire days without drinking. When all the water was gone, only desperation remained. Some began drinking their own urine to stay alive. The air became almost impossible to breathe. The smell of gunpowder mixed with sweat, excrement, and corpses that could no longer be removed. Smoke from the explosions filled the corridors. Every breath felt heavier than the last. Inside, time ceased to exist. The men no longer knew whether it was day or night. They lived only waiting for the next attack. And it always came when the Germans finally penetrated the fortress. The battle took on a terrifying form. There were no massive infantry charges, no long battle lines. The fighting took place in narrow corridors, sometimes less than a meter wide. The soldiers practically bumped into one another before attacking. There was no room to maneuver, nor to flee. Bayonets, trench knives, sharpened entrenching shovels, grenades thrown from just a few meters away. Every turn could conceal an enemy. Every door could mean death. It was brutal combat, silent, personal. The men stopped seeing uniforms. They saw only someone trying to kill them. The fighting continued for days, even without water, even without rest, even while surrounded, but no resistance lasts forever. When Raynal finally accepted surrender, it was not because he had run out of soldiers, nor ammunition. It was because there simply was no water left. His courage impressed even his enemies. Recognizing the extraordinary resistance of the garrison, the German crown prince received Raynal with respect and provided him with a sword to replace the one he had lost during the fighting. It was a rare moment of humanity, a brief gesture of honor. in the midst of the greatest massacre of the First World War. But while one fort fell, France was preparing a response that would completely change Verdun's fate. In Paris, the situation seemed desperate. If Verdun were lost, the moral impact could be devastating for the entire country. When he took command, that was when a commander immediately realized that there was only one connection between Verdun and the rest of France. Pétain, a simple dirt road. Narrow, filled with mud, constantly threatened by enemy artillery. It wasn't much, but it would be enough. Pétain ordered that the road must never stop operating, day and night, without interruption. Thousands of trucks began traveling that route, transporting soldiers, food, ammunition, and equipment. The traffic was so intense that there was only one rule. No vehicle could block the road. If a truck broke down, it was immediately pushed into the ditch. No repairs, no discussion. Another one took its place seconds later. That road would become known as the Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way, because for thousands of French soldiers, it was literally the only road between life and death. But Pétain would make another decision that would save countless soldiers, a simple decision that would completely change the French resistance. There is a limit to the human body, but there is an even smaller limit to the human mind. At Verdun, thousands of soldiers discovered that death was not always the worst fate. Some survived the bombardments, survived the gas, survived the machine guns, but they never managed to escape what they had seen. And it was precisely when the battle seemed impossible to continue that France found a way to prevent the complete collapse of its army. General Philippe Pétain understood a brutal reality. No soldier could remain in that hell for very long without losing the ability to fight. Verdun consumed men at a pace never seen before. Even those who escaped the shrapnel returned completely shattered, both physically and emotionally. It was necessary to prevent the troops from staying on the front line for too long. Then came a solution as simple as it was brilliant. Pétain created a permanent troop rotation system. While one unit fought, another rested. Soon afterward, their roles were reversed. This method became known as the Noria system, inspired by the ancient water wheels that turned endlessly. Just like those wheels, soldiers continuously entered and left the battlefield. The measure saved thousands of lives, but it also had an unexpected consequence. Almost the entire French army would eventually pass through Verdun. Of the 330 regiments that existed at the time, 9 fought in that sector. That meant that virtually an entire generation carried the scars of that place. Even those who survived never returned as the same people, but spending only a few days at Verdun was enough to experience something no military training could prepare anyone for. Because there, nature itself seemed to have been destroyed. The forests had disappeared. The roads no longer existed. The villages had been reduced to heaps of churned-up earth. In place of the French landscape, there was only an ocean of craters. Every hole opened by a shell soon became a small pond. Dark water, thick mud, human remains, dead animals, destroyed equipment. Everything mixed together. The soldiers spent days living inside those craters. They slept in them. They ate in them. They waited for the next attacks in them. When it rained, the ground turned into a swamp. Men sank up to their knees, sometimes up to their waists. Many wounded soldiers simply disappeared into the mud before anyone could rescue them. But the worst was still to come, because the war was about to gain an even more silent weapon. At the beginning of the summer of 1916, the Germans decided to intensify the offensive by using a new chemical agent, phosgene gas. Unlike chlorine, which had been used earlier on other fronts, it had a much more dangerous characteristic. It was almost invisible. There were no large greenish clouds announcing its arrival, no obvious warning signs. Many times, Soldiers realized it was there only when it was already too late. The gas penetrated many of the filters used in the masks of the time. It seeped into trenches, shelters, underground passages. All it took was a single breath. The lungs slowly began to fill with fluid. The victims struggled to breathe. They felt growing pressure in their chests. Then came the coughing, the panic, and in many cases, a slow death by suffocation. Now, the danger came not only from artillery, nor from infantry attacks. The very atmosphere had become a weapon. Every gust of wind could carry death. Meanwhile, the artillery never stopped. The French and Germans fired millions of shells without interruption. The terrain changed completely within a matter of hours. A trench built in the morning could disappear before nightfall. A road could cease to exist. An entire hill could be reduced to a chain of craters. It was impossible to recognize the map. It was impossible to recognize the battlefield itself. The soldiers no longer knew exactly where they were, nor where their own lines ended, nor where enemy territory began. Everything was smoke, mud, explosions, and fear after weeks of living under relentless bombardment. Something began to happen to thousands of soldiers. They remained alive, but they could no longer fight. Some simply stopped responding. They sat staring into nothingness. Others shook uncontrollably. Some completely lost the ability to speak. Some forgot their own names. Some collapsed whenever they heard an explosion. At the time, many officers believed it was cowardice. Today, we know it was severe psychological trauma, the condition known as shell shock. The human brain simply could no longer endure so many extreme stimuli. The soldiers developed a distant stare, empty, as if they were present only physically. It was what would later become known as the 1,000-yard stare. They no longer saw the battlefield. They looked through it, as though part of their minds had remained trapped in Verdun forever. The war was no longer destroying only bodies. Now it was also destroying what could not be seen. The mind. And that may have been its cruelest weapon. After months of uninterrupted fighting, both armies were completely exhausted. The Germans had committed virtually everything to breaking the French resistance. The French continued sending reinforcements without stopping. Every meter gained cost thousands of lives. Every victory lasted only a few days. Every advance was followed by an equally bloody counterattack. The battle no longer made strategic sense, but neither side could bring it to an end. Verdun had ceased to be merely a military objective. It had become a matter of pride, of honor, of national survival, and just when both sides believed victory was within reach, the war would begin to change direction. When the last shots fell silent, the war at Verdun was over. But the true horror was only beginning. Even today, more than a century later, there are areas where no one can live. Forests still conceal unexploded ordnance, and beneath the green fields of France lie thousands of soldiers who never received a name. Verdun won the battle, but it lost an entire generation. During the second half of 1916, the situation slowly began to change. The German offensive, which at first had seemed irresistible, lost momentum. Months of continuous attacks had consumed men, ammunition, and equipment far more quickly than expected. At the same time, another factor forced Germany to divide its attention. In July of that year, the Allies launched the massive Somme offensive. Now the Germans had to fight on two equally devastating fronts. The pressure on Verdun eased. The French recognized the opportunity. Under new organization and with increasingly effective artillery, they launched a series of carefully planned counterattacks. The objective was not to advance quickly. It was to recover, meter by meter, everything that had been lost. Every hill, every trench, every fortification, every advance was won with enormous difficulty. But this time, the initiative was shifting. Little by little, positions that had been considered lost began to be retaken. In October 1916, the French recaptured Fort Douaumont. A few weeks later, it was Fort Vaux's turn. The two symbols of the battle were back in French hands after 10 months of virtually uninterrupted fighting. The front line stood almost exactly where it had been when everything began. It was an ending that was almost impossible to believe. Hundreds of thousands of lives had been sacrificed, so that almost nothing would change on the map. This is perhaps the cruelest portrait of trench warfare. A massive massacre without a truly decisive victory. When the battle finally ended, in December 1916, the numbers seemed unreal. France recorded approximately 377,000 casualties, including those killed, wounded, and missing. On the German side, there were around 337,000 dulls. In total, more than 700,000 men were struck down during those 10 months, and among them, more than 300,000 never returned home. Every number concealed a story: a son, a brother, a student, a farmer, a father, a life cut. Short before it had truly begun, but Verdun left scars that went far beyond the statistics. The landscape itself had been transformed forever. After the war ended, teams sent to survey the region made a terrifying discovery. There were areas that were completely contaminated. The soil was saturated with heavy metals, chemicals, arsenic, toxic residues. Millions of unexploded shells remained buried. Underground, the destruction was so severe that some regions were considered impossible to restore. The French government then made an unprecedented decision. It declared part of that territory permanently off-limits. Thus was born the so-called Red Zone, an area where nature and war continue to coexist to this day. Even more than 100 years later, farmers still find bombs while preparing the land. Experts remove thousands of munitions every year, and there are places where it is simply not safe to build houses. Verdun is still at war, only in a silent way among all the small communities destroyed by the battle. One of them became a symbol of the devastation, Fleury devant Douaumont. During the fighting, that small village changed hands several times. Every advance was followed by a counterattack. Every reconstruction was immediately destroyed by new bombardments. When the war ended, there was nothing left to rebuild. The houses had disappeared. The church no longer existed. The streets had vanished beneath tons of churned up earth. Even so, the village was never officially dissolved. It still exists in the French records. Today, signs scattered across the site indicate where the school, the bakery, the town hall, and the former homes once stood. It is a town without inhabitants, without streets, without buildings, only memories as if time had stopped in 1916. There is one place in Verdun that encapsulates the entire tragedy of the First World War, the Douaumont ossuary. At first glance, it seems to be just a monument, but inside, it holds something impossible to forget. There rest the remains of approximately 130,000 soldiers who could never be identified, French, German, forever, mixed together, without a name, without a rank, without a nationality. Through small windows located at the base of the building, it is possible to see piles of skulls, femurs, and other carefully preserved bones. After so much destruction, the differences disappeared. There are no victors there, nor the defeated. There are only human beings who were consumed by a war that seemed to have no end. Perhaps that is Verdun's greatest lesson. On the battlefield, death does not choose flags. Verdun was not only the longest battle of the First World War, it was a turning point in human history. There, it became clear that technology, when placed at the service of war, was capable of turning men into numbers and entire cities into unrecognizable landscapes. The objective was no longer merely to defeat the enemy. It became wearing them down to their absolute limit. It was the industrialization of destruction. More than a century later, the fields appear peaceful. The grass has grown back. The forests have been reborn. But beneath that seemingly ordinary soil, fragments of bombs, rusted helmets, and thousands of bones that were never recovered still lie buried. Verdun remains a permanent reminder of the price of war, a warning that when dialogue fails and extremism takes the place of reason, humanity risks repeating exactly the same mistakes. If you enjoy historical documentaries told in a cinematic style and want to understand the events that changed the world, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every week we bring you new true stories about wars, empires, battles, and the figures who shaped history, because understanding the past may be the best way to prevent it from repeating itself.